Welcome, guys. So good to see you today. And wow, do you look good today? And it seems like you're ready for the story challenge I prepared just for you. But still, I bet you won't be guessing, alright? I will tell you three creepy stories, but one will be something I've wrote and made up in my mind the last 2 days. So lay back, relax, and listen very carefully and get ready to be terrified. We're also guessing if the story I just tell you is real or fiction. And let's see who wins the bet. Also, I will reveal the truth at the end, so be sure to have picked the one you think it's a lie and let me know. So if you're ready, let's do this. Every day, we humans share millions of stories. However, some are true things people experience, and some are nothing other than fiction. There are stories of joy, happiness, sorrow, and all, but the stories I will tell you today are creepy camping stories that will make your blood go cold and question the reality you live in. And it's no different with Matt's story. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt was planning on a camping near Mount Rainier in Washington state. His job was so hectic and stressful that in the rare times when he got the chance to, he would disappear into the wilderness for a few days to clear his head and be alone in the nature. Despite living in one of the biggest cities in the world, Matt was actually a very competent and experienced outdoorsman, and so for this trip he decided he would stay way off any trail deep in the backcountry in random locations. So without having planned out a route for his trip and also without letting anyone know, he spontaneously went on his way into the arms of the wilderness in Washington state. On the first night, he found a nice clearing in the trees, and so he set up his campsite there and he ate some food over his fire, looked at the lights in the horizon from a place that is pitch black, and after some time the fresh air made his eyes slowly get heavy, so he pitched his tent, climbed inside, and within a few minutes he was fast asleep. Several hours later, Matt woke up to some strange sounds coming from outside of his tent. It sounded like a couple of animals, or maybe one animal, moving around right outside near his fire pit, straight ahead of him. So after a while of just hearing this constant sound, he got curious of what animal that might be. So he rolled over and he barely unzipped his tent flap just to look out and see if he could see whatever animal it was. And what he saw shocked him. There was a man sitting in front of his fire pit. The fire was out, but the moon was enough of a light source if you're in full darkness. And this guy was just sitting there with his hands on his knees, looking straight down, and periodically he would just kick his feet in the ashes of the fire pit. And Matt didn't even know what to do, so he's just looking at him through his little tiny gap in his tent, and this man all of a sudden looks up directly at Matt and makes eye contact with him, and the guy's eyes go wide, and he stands up, turns around, and runs away from Matt's campsite. Matt has no idea how to react to this, and so he's just quickly unzips his tent, jumps outside, and shines his light into the forest looking for the guy. He's thinking to himself, who is this guy? I'm in the middle of nowhere in the back country of Washington state. How long was he sitting outside there for? What does he want? And so as Matt is trying to make sense of this totally weird thing, he's thinking, okay, I'm going to look out and I'm going to see his flashlight somewhere, or I'm going to see his campsite he's set up nearby, and he's looking around into the total darkness. He's looking through all the trees, any light source anywhere out there he would see, and there's there's no fire, there's no flashlight, there's nothing. And so eventually Matt goes back inside of his tent, he sets it up, and he's just left kind of dumbfounded. He can't understand how some person was just sitting outside of his tent for no apparent reason and then vanished into the forest without even turning on a flashlight. And so, after a very restless night, finally the sun came up again, and Matt was very relieved. He stepped outside, and after a little bit of time now from this strange incident, Matt started to tell himself that all that was is just some guy happened to set up his campsite nearby. It is possible, even though it's rare, because we're in a backcountry, and maybe he was just intoxicated and he wandered over here, and stranger things have happened to Matt. So that's probably all it was. And so Matt felt like there was nothing to worry about, so he packed up his campsite and he began hiking further into the forest. So as said previously, Matt didn't have a planned route. Instead, he had a map and a compass, and he began just kind of wandering in the forest, kind of exploring wherever he wanted to go. And over the next 2 days, he covered at least 50 miles in kind of random zigzag directions. And then it was again getting dark, so he found a nice clearing and he set up another campsite. That night he set up a fire and he was eating some food near his fire. And then as he's sitting there, he hears rustling coming from behind him. He's pretty sure it's an animal, so he turns around and he doesn't see anything, and he goes back to eating his food. And then a little while later, he hears some more rustling behind him, and this time he can't really just write it off. Clearly there is something behind him that's moving around, and so he stood up, turned around, and remained motionless and just listened to the forest deep inside the darkness where all the trees turned pitch black because of the night, expecting to see maybe a deer come out of the woods, but instead he hears a man's voice come out of the darkness that says,
"Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?"
And Matt's heart starts racing. He knows that even though he can't see him, it has to be the same guy, because they are in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't seen any other hikers or campers or anyone, and clearly this guy has the ability to sneak up on him. And so he's thinking, what does this guy want? I just spent the past 2 days hiking around them directions for 50 miles, and he must have followed me. And so Matt, not knowing what else to do, just says, I don't know where the Bell Canyon is. And then there's silence, and one part of Matt is thinking, I hope this guy does not come into the light, I hope he just goes away. But the other part of him is thinking, well, maybe this is a different person that is lost and they're looking for this place called Bell's Canyon, and they'll come into the light. It'll be a big relief. I'll send them on their merry way, and everything will be fine. But as Matt is having this wishful thinking, the voice from the shadows does not come any closer, but instead asks the same question a bit more forcefully this time. Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon? This time Matt did not respond. No, he was scared. This is not some friendly hiker looking for directions. There's something wrong. And so Matt, knowing he's all alone out there, he knew he had to do something to try to take control of the situation. And so he took a deep breath and reached down and grabbed his flashlight, and in one swift motion he lifted his light up and shined it in the direction of this guy's voice. And what he saw was this guy from 2 days ago looking out from behind a tree right in Matt's direction. It was hiding from him, and when the light hit him, the man barked at Matt to aim it away, and Matt kind of instinctively lowered his light, but now he was too scared to raise it again, and now he knows it's the same guy. This guy has been following me for 2 days, and so for several minutes, Matt just stood there, absolutely terrified, and this guy, he just stayed out there. Matt didn't hear him move. It was complete silence. It was just a complete standstill, and then the silence was broken yet again by this voice, except somehow he had moved even closer to Matt, and when he came through, asking the same question, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" His voice was so close to Matt that Matt got scared and raised his light up, and the man was standing just a few feet away from him, and this time the man's eyes got wide like they did the first time they saw Matt, and he turned around and he ran into the forest again. Matt, not knowing any better, just began running after him, but he only ran for about 30 seconds before he realized the terrain out here is so rough, he's going to fall, get hurt, he's going to get lost, and this guy's already long gone. He somehow managed to run immediately so far away, and so Matt just goes back to his campsite, and he's thinking to himself, what do I do? I have no cell phone service. I'm at least 3 days away from my car, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one even knows where I am, because I didn't chart the course. I didn't tell anyone where I was gonna be, and so Matt just grabbed his knife and stood in the middle of the campsite, and for hours and hours he just kept looking around, expecting this guy to just show up again or start speaking to him from somewhere out in the darkness. It was absolutely horrifying. Finally, by about 3 in the morning, Matt was so tired that he had to go to sleep. He hadn't heard this guy again, he didn't see him again, and he figured, I need a little bit of sleep because tomorrow he's going to pack up his campsite and begin this epic journey back to his car. So he climbed in his tent, and he had a very restless next couple of hours, and the sun came up. Matt jumped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and began practically running in the direction of his car. All day as he was hiking, Matt kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this guy, because clearly he had followed him for multiple days, over 15 miles, and so the likelihood that he's still following him was really high. And so all day Matt just felt like he was being watched. He was totally terrified, and then the sun started to go down, and Matt knew he would have to camp out again, and so he found a clearing in the trees. He set up his campsite, and he was so tired from running basically all day and being so mentally exhausted from this experience that he just got in his tent and fell asleep very quickly. But several hours later, he woke up to the sound of somebody walking around his tent. He knew it had to be this guy. He's still in the middle of nowhere. He's not even close to the parking lot yet, and so this guy is still following him. And so Matt sat up in his tent, he clutched his knife, and for hours and hours and hours, all night, this guy just walked around his campsite, and then around 4 or 5 in the morning, he scampered off when the sun finally came up. Matt leaped out of his tent, packed up his stuff, and literally just began running in the direction of his car, hoping that maybe he could get there before needing to camp out one more night. And so all day as he moved, he's looking over his shoulders, knowing this guy is following him at this point, and it's not even a question. He's somewhere in the forest, but he could never see him. And unfortunately, as the sun was setting, he knew he was not going to be able to make it to his car. It was just too far away, and so at some point, when it got dark, to keep moving, he had to find a clearing and set up his tent again. And so, once his tent was set up, he just climbed inside, he zipped it up behind him, he grabbed his knife and sat there, knowing this guy was somewhere out there, and he sat there expecting to hear this guy come walking around, but after several hours, he didn't hear him. And Matt started to wonder, maybe this guy has left me alone finally. Maybe he's not following me anymore. And so Matt, who was totally exhausted, laid down to go to sleep. And then as he's laying there, from somewhere out in the woods, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" Matt immediately sat up. His heart began racing so fast that he actually was concerned he might have a heart attack. He felt cold shivering down his spine, all his muscles tensed up. He had goosebumps all over his body, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what to say, so he just sat there holding his knife. And then this guy began running past his campsite, making animal sounds, and he would stop periodically and moan and groan, and he'd kick up leaves, and then he'd run past his campsite again, over and over and over again, until the sun finally came up, and this guy scrambled off back into the woods again. Matt didn't waste any time, and any second he left his tent, packed his stuff up, and ran all the way back to his car. When he finally got inside of his car, shut the door, and locked it, he cried tears of joy. He was so unbelievably relieved, and he peeled out of the parking lot, and he got to a nearby hotel and finally got a cell phone reception, and he considered calling the police about the guy, but he thought, what am I gonna tell them? He didn't commit any crime. He was just terrifying, and so he decided not to call the police. He finally flew back to New York, and he just had to accept that there was some strange guy out in the wilderness of Washington State who was able to hunt him over 3 days and 30 miles in rugged terrain without the use of a flashlight, without any gear, and all he ever said to Matt was, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" Hello guys, so quick reminder, new merch is out. Actually my first merch, 2 designs, one being Love of the Season and one being Immortal Souls. I'm pretty sure you will like that. It's very comfortable also, the stuff, and yeah, just check it out, link in the description, and show your love, man. Yeah, let's get back to the stuff. Thankfully, Matt wasn't hurt or anything while camping. But that can't be said about Robert and his friends. But for that, we need to go to Bluff Mountain, one of the most haunted forests in the US. At least that's what the locals say. So, I kindly ask you to hit the like button and make it turn blue and tie it up with the subscribe button, so they have nowhere to go. Alright. Friends are random strangers we decide to trust over the course of time. Some last until the day death does us apart, and some lead to your own death. But you really don't know in advance. So everyone does a little gambling in life, and it's no different with these 5 friends who will experience that in a very traumatic and deadly occurrence in the middle of the haunted forest, Bluff Mountain, Virginia. Robert, Martinez, and John are planning to do a 1-week camping in so-called forest, Bluff Mountain in Virginia, to rank up their views on their new YouTube channel. The 3 explorers were experts in things that involved the supernatural. So in February in 2008, these 3 and Robert's girlfriend at the time, Julianne, made their way from Baltimore to Virginia, and on the way they would pick up their friend Colby, who was an experienced outdoorsman and was camping quite often since he was a kid. When they arrived at Richmond to pick up Colby, Before driving the next last hour trip, they decided they pick up as much resources as they need from here so they don't need to make another stop and directly go to their destination. And since they had all their equipment with them, there was just not enough space to fit all the stuff in Robert's car, and even if they did, these 5 friends would absolutely not fit in that car after all that stuff. So Colby, who's also a Jeeper, tells Robert that he'll follow them with his Jeep and they can put some of the equipment in his Jeep, and that James and Martinez can drive with him so that everyone has enough space and also a comfortable ride, since they're also planning on a little hike until the sunset when they reach Bluff Mountain. So they all agree with Colby's idea and make their way to the Bluff Mountain with a little convoy. So after arriving at Bluff Mountain, all 5 picked up their stuff and slowly made their way up, trying to reach a nice spot to set up their camp for the next 7 days. Colby was the lead, even though he never been here before. Still, everyone trusted Colby to be able to lead them to a clear opening. After roughly 1 hour of hiking, however, it started to get dark and all the friends decided that it is better to set up the campsite now, where they still have a little sunlight until the sun fully sets. Later that night, these friends would gather around the fire and everyone would tell creepy camper stories, and Martinez, he would film everything so they have good and enough footage for their video. Everything was fun. They had beers, they had snacks, and they all laughed, and then everyone climbed into their own tent, and Robert and Julianne, these two had a tent together. They climbed in theirs, and late at night at around 2 a.m. Robert felt the need to pee. So he zipped open his tent, climbed outside, but as he did, he saw Colby standing outside next to his tent, and his back was turned to Robert's tent, and he was looking deep into the darkness like he was searching for something specific. So Robert calls out to Colby and asks him what he's doing out here late at night, and Colby would turn only his head and tell Colby that he thought he heard a woman talking, so he was looking for nearby campsites, but he didn't see any. So Robert, who didn't want to make the others freak out, told him that it was most probably Colby's mind playing with him. So he walked past Martinez's tent and stopped next to James while looking at Colby, and told him they better get to sleep because tomorrow will be a long and exhausting day. The next morning, the friends picked up their stuff and hiked further into the forest, and after 4 hours of hike, they finally reached the spot they thought was the perfect spot to set up the campsite and their gear to capture the supernatural. What was the plan for this camp all along? Now, they needed to wait for the sun to set, and the plan was simple. Robert and James were the ones who would call for those ghosts, and Martinez's job was to capture everything on camera. Colby and Julian would just watch and witness everything that was about to happen, but they truly didn't know what they have gotten themselves into. Now, after several hours of preparing and resting for the night, it was time to get the investigation going. At 3 a.m., Robert started to call out random names and asking random questions using a Ouija board and inviting them to join them. Julian would tell in numerous interviews that when Robert was calling out the random names, she felt like someone was watching them, and that she felt an eerie cold touching on all of her body. And suddenly James yells at Martinez to shoot the tree line where he thought he heard someone talk while pointing his finger deep into the trees, into the forest. But whenever Martinez would point the camera at the direction, the camera would blur itself, even though they lit up the place pretty good. James also was fully blurred, so the friends were totally weirded out by all of this. But after trying so much without any success, Colby suggested it is better that they use the next hours of the night for some rest, and tomorrow they could figure out how they will proceed the ghost hunt. The following night, the friends put some noise traps all around the campsite, so when something would move, those traps would start to play some music, as long as the entity was around the device. So they again went to sleep after setting up everything at around 8 p.m. and they plan to sleep until 2 a.m. so that they have a clear mind and are fully recovered for the rest of the night. But Julianne would say at around 12:30 a.m., so around midnight, she heard one of the devices went off and played this subtle music, what showed them something was around the campsite. To understand the layout, we need to understand how the tents were set up. So they kind of made a circle with 4 tents. On the right of Julianne's and Robert's tent was Colby's tent, and on the left was Martinez's, the cameraman's tent, and right in front of them was James's tent, and right behind James's tent was a tree line. All right, and the music came from the between Colby's and James's device, between their tent. So when the device went off, there also were rustings coming from that side of the campsite, and James eventually would wake up, get out of his tent, and walk in that direction. Now Julia was too afraid to open up the tent on her own, but also worried that something would happen to James so late at night. So she woke up Robert and told him, "Robert, wake up. James got out of his tent when the device went off. You gotta check on your friend." So Robert eventually would wake up, get his flashlight and his knife, and slowly zip open the tent and look out for his friend James, but he was nowhere to be seen. So he goes to Colby's tent and wakes him up, since he's the experienced one in the wild, and then they both will wake up Martinez, and they kind of point their flashlight in every direction looking for James, calling his name, listening if they can hear his sound, but there was nothing. Now, their campsite was actually in the middle of a clearing. You at least had to walk around 40 to 15 feet to reach the forest. So either James sprinted the whole way to the forest, or it was impossible for him to reach the forest by walking in that short amount of time. And also they calling his name, so he would hear them and yell back at them at least, and then come back, but he didn't do neither of these things. That's when the friends started to get worried, since James was actually the scared one in all of these 5 friends, and dead all the time. So why would he disappear into the dark woods? Also, he suffered from somnambulism, what is also known as sleepwalking. So the friends figure, you know what? We gotta help James. Something ain't right, and James most probably needs our help right now. So the 3 boys make a plan where 2, Martinez and Colby, will walk towards the tree line Julianne last heard James walking towards, and Robert and Julianne will wait at the campsite for the possibility James returns. Then they both will let Colby and Martinez know per radio that he's back, so they both can return. So Martinez also takes his camera with him, and Colby, he takes his rifle and leaves his gun with the couple, since they are in the wilderness and you never know. But he also tells them that wild animals won't usually come close to the fire, so keep the campfire lit until we come back and you should be totally okay, So Robert and Julianne watch as they both slowly disappear behind the tree line, and it's now around 1 a.m. so there's no light, it's pitch black, and they both sitting as close as possible to the fire, and Julianne laid her head on Robert's shoulder, and she was kind of frightened by being spread out like that in the middle of the night, and Robert kind of has a stick he found on the way up to the campsite, and he always loved to hold onto great sticks with a great shape until the camp is over. So he was again carrying this 3-foot long stick, what was kind of dry, but He thought he could use this to scare away animals if he would lit it up and use it like a torch, and he kinda was trying to comfort Julian, who was kinda freaked out by all of this and also felt guilty for not immediately getting out of her tent and stop James. They wouldn't have spread out like that if she did that. That was what she believed. So as Robert was comforting her girlfriend, Colby from the other end reaches out to them at around 2:30 in the morning and asks them if Martinez ever came back to the camp because he was supposed to be following him, but when he turned back to check on him, he suddenly wasn't there. So Robert and Julian are really confused because why would Martinez turn back from the woods all alone in the middle of the night without letting Colby know? So Robert tells Colby that he most likely lost you and instead walking further into the unknown, he most likely turned back and that that's a tough man, so probably Colby also should return and that if he's fast enough he could catch up with Martinez on the way back. And first thing in the morning they search for James and also call the police and let the park rangers know. So after 1 hour, so it's past 3:30 in the morning, Julian and Robert heard voices back from the tree line where Colby and Martinez went into the forest. So they both are relieved, thinking, alright, they're both back pretty quick, so we again are together. We felt much safer. But after waiting a couple of minutes, suddenly the voices were gone, and neither of the friends showed up in the clearing they were at. So they both kind of felt terrified, but Robert tries his best to not show it towards Julianne so she could calm down and all. And yes, he was worried about his friends, but also about his girlfriend, so he needed to act professional and calm so he could handle the situation properly. So he first called out, "Hey Colby, Martinez, is that you? Did you find James?" And there was no sound. So Robert again called their names and told them if that's them, they should let him know so he wouldn't fire his gun on accident. But it seemed like nothing was out there. At that moment, they both felt that eerie and dark presence of something that was lurking behind those trees, and they genuinely felt like they are being watched. So Robert did not call out again. Instead, he pulled out his gun, and while looking at the direction they felt the presence of the thing, he tries to radio Colby just to check on him, but after several attempts without any success, they both just sit close to each other, desperately waiting for a sign from their friends. But there was no sound until at around 3:50 in the morning, they heard someone cry right at the tree line. So you have to imagine all this happens so fast that they don't even have the chance to clear their head. Julian is crying and constantly blaming herself, and that puts Robert under heavy pressure. But even though he himself is terrified because of all of this, his girlfriend's condition also made thinking straight and logically a lot harder for him. So he still tries to comfort Julianne and tells her that they will call the police next thing in the morning and that they always experience things like this in their investigations, and also that Colby was an amazing outdoorsman and a pretty skilled survivalist, so he's probably still looking for Martinez, and that's why he still isn't back. He not just told her that to only comfort Julianne, but it also kind of was a way for him to comfort himself. So when they heard someone crying in the middle of nowhere, they were utterly confused and were like, could that be one of the three friends who found his way back? So Robert's initial thought was just to call out to whoever was crying out there. He was like, "Hello, you need any help?" But Julianne didn't feel like that this was a good idea, and she felt like they were in danger. So looking at Robert, she was just like, "Shh." And she was also crying, and Robert could definitely tell his girlfriend was extremely terrified, so he stops calling out into the darkness and suggests her to better get inside the tent and wait for 2 hours there until the sun rises. So they put more 2-3 inches of firewood into the fire, so it would last at least for another 2 to 3 hours and they would be safe. So they get into the tent, zip it up, and just sat there listening to the surroundings. And the first thing they noticed was that the crying was gone and that outside everything was suddenly so quiet. There was an unsettling silence that made them both very, very uncomfortable. So Robert holds Julian's head and gently presses it on his chest to make her feel safe, and they just lay down to go to sleep. And Julian said that the warm hug made her fall asleep very quickly. At around 5:50 in the morning, she woke up to a banging sound like a gun got fired. So she sits down with a sudden move and listens to her surroundings. At that time, you kind of could see the starting line in the horizon where the sun will rise, but she noticed that Robert wasn't in the tent. So she got worried and she jumped out of her tent and looked around and then looked at the right side where Colby and Martinez went, and then she turned her head slowly to the left looking at the tree line, and she kind of noticed someone out of the corner of her eye sitting next to her just a couple of feet away from her left. And when she turned her head to that person, what she saw shocked her. It was Colby sitting there with his rifle looking at the same entrance he went in the forest last night. Or did he not? Actually, he did not, and Colby and Julianne were still waiting for the three friends to come back from their investigation. Later, her psychologist will confirm that she suffered from confabulation. That is the unintentional creation of false memories and also believing in it themselves. So she kind of was confused from all of this, but then she started to get concerned for her boyfriend and his friends. So she kind of told her worries and fears to Colby, and Colby agreed since they were gone for over 6 hours now, and just radioed Colby once, and that was 4 hours earlier, and he haven't heard from them since. So they both decide leaving the camp like that and only pick the necessary equipment, so if the friends would return while they are gone getting help, they have a place to settle down and wait for Colby and Julianne. So Colby writes a short letter telling them to wait there for them and that they will be back soon. So after hiking 5 hours back to Colby's Jeep, they get in, start the engine, and they directly make their way to the Sevier County Sheriff's Office, but it's almost 40 miles away from them, so it's over a half an hour drive. When they arrive, they meet Chief Deputy John Reeves, who initially was the one who took all the necessary information about the missing friends and then took it to Sheriff Barrett Regan, who organized a big search party for the lost friends. So on February 16, 2008, a big group of experienced people started to search the area in and out. But the direction Colby and Julian had given them was not somewhere with a trail, and it was too dense to walk around those low-hanging limbs. And since they were unsuccessful tracing anything that would lead them to the lost friends, they decided to check also the opposite direction of the mountain. The third day of the search, they started to search around the radius of 12 miles from the campsite, and that's when a dog catches a scent of something what made it run off, and when they catched up with the dog, there he was, Martinez, deceased with his camera next to him, and whatever had killed him inflicted no wounds at all, unlike Robert, who was found 300 feet away from Martinez, whose feet and fingers were cut off. So the search continued for 6 more days after the bodies were brought back, but James was never found ever again. This tragic event and death of 2 young friends and the disappearance of James made everyone terrified and surprised that a beautiful place can be that dark. So some believe this is a haunted place, it was a demon, and some say James killed his friends and then disappeared. But don't worry, since you tied up the subscribe button and the like button together, they won't be able to hunt the hunter. When I was a kid, one of my favorite places to go in the whole world was going to the little forest or cornfields we had close to our house. Me and 2 friends of mine were always there to explore, play, and enjoy the early years of our lives. But since where we lived was totally rural and were lots of forests everywhere, we were always told to be home before the sun sets and it's totally dark outside. Because although it was like this vast expanse of wilderness and beauty in daylight, as soon as it got dark at night, we would all be quick to go back inside because there were huge animals that lived in the wilderness of this little place we all called home. And as much as I wanted to see werewolves and vampires when looking out of my window as a kid with a great fantasy, I'm thankful now that I never had to witness anything like that, but still, that doesn't mean no one does. A new family in Maine, also a totally rural place where only 2,000 people lived at the time, is going to witness a horror they never would have thought of before moving in. In 2005, Eric Martin was working in a paper mill in Maine. He had been working at this paper mill for 20 years, so he had a good experience in his job. But however, one day he was reaching up to get something on a shelf when he threw his bag out, and in fact, he had slipped a number of discs, and it ultimately meant that he was not able to work anymore. He was going to be disabled, and so he's suddenly out of work. His wife, Shelley Martin, on the other hand, was not working at the time, but when he couldn't work, she needed to get a job. And so Shelley, who had not worked in a long time, was able through some connections to land a job in her hometown in Maine called Palmyra. Palmyra was a very small rural community. I mean, we're talking maybe 1,200 people that lived there. They also had a 70-year-old daughter named Chelsea who was not eager to go, but it was the only place they could afford, and so they had to go. Luckily, because Palmyra was such a cheap place to live, they actually ended up getting a bigger piece of property for less money than they had lived in before. It's this beautiful farmhouse that sat on a whole bunch of acreages, but it was incredibly isolated. You had to go down this bumpy access road to get to their long driveway, and then once you were on their property, you'd look out and it was just a full 360 degrees, a very dense forest that virtually no one was in. There was no nature trails, it was just dark, dense forest everywhere you looked, you know? So even though no one's that happy about it, they end up moving into this farmhouse, and as they unpacking their truck, Eric picks up one of his many rifles that he owned. Now Eric came from a long line of hunters. He loved to hunt. It was his favorite thing to do, and he had a whole bunch of guns that he kept. And as he's carrying the rifles into the house, Shelley says, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house. You have a barn. You're going to put your guns in there, you know?" This had always been a point of contention for them in their marriage. Shelley just didn't feel safe having guns in a house, especially having kids in there. And so ultimately, Eric agrees. "Okay, fine, I won't put my guns in the house. I put him in a barn. And so he went in the barn with his son, Sean, who had come out to help his family. So father and son together built this gun case for all of his rifles. It was very heavy duty. They put it in a barn and then they locked the case and then locked the barn itself. So the guns were totally secure in the barn, but definitely not readily accessible. Over the first year, Shelley and Eric developed this ritual where at the end of the day they would go out on the front porch and of the farmhouse and look out onto the front yard and they would drink coffee. It was something they both looked forward to, and virtually every night they did this. And so almost exactly a year after moving in, it was in early 2006, Shelley and Eric are sitting on the front porch enjoying their coffee while also chatting. But then suddenly Shelley thinks she sees something in the woods. Now you have to understand the layout and how far away they are from the woods to get a sense of what they are seeing. So right in front of the porch was a gravel road where they parked their cars about 20 meters away from their house. To the left is their barn, and beyond the barn, basically straight out, was a clearing until you reach the forest. From the porch is this huge open field where there's no trees or anything. It was like open grazing area, and then way beyond the field was the beginning of the tree line of this really dense forest. So we're talking at least a couple hundred meters away where she sees these lights, and she describes it as like pulsating lights. It didn't look like a car or some sort of vehicle, not to mention there was no road. Out straight ahead from their porch, it was just a dense forest where there was absolutely no one that should have been in there. Eric immediately, when he sees the lights, he thinks there's a poacher on his property. So someone was illegally hunting on his property, and so he gets Sean, his son, who did not live with them but was staying that night. He gets him to come outside and asks Sean, hey, do you think there's a poacher down there at the edge of the tree line? And Sean's like, I don't know, maybe. So Eric decides that he wants to go tell this person to leave his property, and so he asks Sean to come with him. They figured they would just get to the edge of the property and yell out, hey, this is private property, you need to leave. As they walking across the field and they're getting closer to the tree line, the light, those pulsating lights, begin to fade and disappear back into the woods. And they get all the way up to the tree line and they can't see any lights at all. And even though at this point, standing on the edge of the forest, Eric and Sean are fairly confident that this poacher has left, they decide, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods, even though it's totally dark. We're not gonna get lost. We'll walk a little ways into the woods and just continue to yell, this is private property, leave. And yeah, so they really do leave, and so they begin walking, and it's a very dense forest. Lots of low-hanging limbs. It's not somewhere that's easy to walk. There's no walking trails or anything like that. And they walk 10, 50 meters into the woods. And then they suddenly hear what sounds like someone walking parallel to them, maybe 50 meters away from them on their left. And they both stop and they look around and each other. They didn't want to take any chance that they were being stalked by a predator, and so they thought, you know what, the lights are gone, I don't know what animal this is, let's just get out of here. And they both leave. About a month goes by, and Nathan, who is Chelsea's boyfriend, was staying with the family at the farm, and it was the first nice spring day before that. It was a very dark, dreary and cold winter. Winters tend to be that way, and so That weekend, Nathan and Chelsea decided, let's go walk around the woods. You know? So they take the two family dogs and they start walking across that big field in front of the house into the forest, the same area where Sean and Eric have been looking for those lights and left because they heard what sounded like an animal that was near them. So at first Chelsea had the dogs on leashes, but they get to the forest and she lets them off the leash to let them go run around and go crazy because they've been cooped up because of the winter time as well. The two dogs instantly take off running for about 100 meters and then they come to a dead stop right outside this big mound. It looks like a dirt mound, but they get up close to it and they can tell that it's actually more like a den. There are these huge pieces of wood that have been leaned into like a lean-to type structure with moss and dirt and grass put all over the outside. I mean, it looks like a very intentionally made mound, and there's a circular hole that's been created right on the front of it. And the dogs have stopped right outside and they poking their heads in and smelling into this hole. And Nathan and Chelsea are looking at this thinking, who did this? Is this like a hunter's thing? Is this something a hunter might make? Would an animal make this? This seems really big for some animal to make, but it definitely was made on purpose, whatever it is. And so Nathan, he just kind of looks down into the stand, but it's totally dark and he thinks he hears growling coming from inside of the stand. And so without any hesitation, he goes, we gotta go. I don't know what's living in there, but we gotta go. And so they take the dogs and put them back on leashes, and the two of them get out of the forest as quickly as they can. When Nathan and Chelsea came back to the house, they told Eric and Shelly and Sean, who happened to be there as well, hey, we found this stand of some kind out in the middle of the woods, basically straight out from your front porch. And that's when Eric and Sean looked at each other and said, well, about a month ago we were out there at that same area and we could have sworn we heard some animals stalking us. A couple of months go by and Eric and Shelly are sitting on the front porch having their coffee ritual, and there was just this low mist that kind of hung over the entire field, and as they sitting there, they commenting on how creepy it was, and what started as just kind of a friendly discussion about the general creepiness took a turn when they realized that they couldn't hear any wildlife. No crickets, no animals, no anything. And normally at night, because they were out here all the time, it was humming with life. And so Shelly had this high-powered flashlight that she always had out with her, and she starts scanning the property and not knowing what she's looking for, but it just seemed really odd that they couldn't hear any wildlife. But after she scans across the whole field, she doesn't see anything. So she puts her flashlight down and just starts talking Eric about whatever they normally talk about over coffee at night. But for whatever reason, when she put that flashlight down, Eric suddenly felt like they were in danger. He's looking out, but he doesn't see anything. And then all of a sudden he says, you know what? We gotta go inside. I don't know what it is, but we gotta go inside. And Shelly's like, come on, I wanna stay out here for a little bit longer. We go in a few minutes. And Eric stands up and he's like, no, go inside. And he tries to grab her to kind of push her into the house. And she's kind of fighting against him. And all of a sudden, Shelly stops and she goes, did you hear that? And Eric immediately knew that whatever it was, it's the reason he had that sudden feeling of being in danger. Eric turns around and he can't see anything because it's too dark. Shelly grabs her flashlight and she begins scanning the tree line, and she gets to the field and gets about halfway across the field right in front of them, and she stops because right in the middle of the field are three creatures that look like huge wolves. These huge creatures are looking right at them. And two other join them coming out of the forest, so there's five wolf-alike, bear-sized creatures that are staring at them. Right from the middle of their field. And she says to Eric, "What are those?" And Eric, who's an experienced hunter, he has no idea. He goes, "I think they're bears. They could be wolves. But we gotta go inside." And so Shelly's just holding the light, and they start charging directly at her so fast that she wasn't able to keep the light on them. Yeah? They were already halfway across the field. They go inside, they shut the door, and they lock it, and without saying the word, the two of them make the rounds across the entire bottom floor, locking every door, closing every window and every blind, and make sure everything is shut. There was something different about these five creatures. The way they started running towards them, it just felt like they were targeting Eric and Shelly. And so even after the house has been secured, they didn't feel safe. And so they're standing in the middle of the cabin, and Eric's saying, "My guns are in the barn. We have no protection." And Shelly's like, "Whatever you do not go out there. We don't know what these are. It could be a bear, it could be a wolf, or it's neither of them and something else. We don't know, so don't go out there and risk your life." Shelly goes upstairs, she shuts up all the lights, she makes sure all the windows are shut, and then she goes to Chelsea's room, her daughter, and she wakes her up and she says, "Hey, you come here, you gotta look at this." And they go to the window and they kind of like poke their head into the window because they don't want to like totally open it up and stare out because they don't want the creatures to see them. They kind of poking their head out the window, and she's like, "Look," and standing on the gravel are these five creatures that are just standing in a row looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting for them to come out the front door. They were just patiently standing there looking at the house. It did not look like normal animal behavior at all. You know what I mean? And as she's looking, one of the animals looks up at Shelly in a window, and the creature gets on its hind legs, so it's standing on its two legs now, and looks at her directly at Shelly's eyes. Shelly's frozen for a second and just looks at it. Then she gasps and falls over because the creature's like 8 feet tall. And so Shelly on the ground looking at her daughter Chelsea, and Chelsea looks at her. Her mom was shaking. It was clear her mom, Shelly, can't believe what she just saw. And Shelly tries to make a sense of all of this. It's like her brain can't process that this creature had even seen her. They barely had the head up in a window, but it stood on its hind legs, and it was so big and did see them. And also, what are they doing? Sitting in a row right on the outside of the house, waiting for us. What's going on here? And so Shelly tells Chelsea, "Get in your bed. Don't go to your windows. Don't leave this room." That's when Shelly also remembers that she hasn't heard her two dogs. Now she's worried they might be outside, and so she starts quietly walking all along the top floor looking for her dogs. She's calling to her two dogs, but they don't come out. So she goes into the master bedroom and finds her two dogs hiding in the corner of the room next to each other, like they startled by whatever it is outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs, thinking he needed to go to the barn and he needed to get his guns to protect his family, but he knew that because of his own disability, he can barely walk very fast, and he'd have to unlock the barn, then he'd have to pull down the gun case, unlock that, all the while he's exposed to these animals that are out there waiting for them to just come out. So the next best thing in his mind is maybe he could run outside, get in his truck, and back the truck up to the front door. Then he could get his wife, his daughter to come out, jump in the car, and they could just drive away. So he just goes to the window and he pulls the blinds aside to look outside, and those 5 creatures are now gone. They're not sitting on a gravel path right in front of the house. He doesn't know where they are, but they're not in front of the house, and so he closes the blinds and he's like, well, I don't know where they are. It's so dangerous to go out there right now. He starts pacing somewhere and he goes back to look and he sees them back in the field where they first saw them. All 5 creatures are back where they initially got spotted. They're facing the house still, but he can't see them because the moon has now popped through and he's got illumination on the field. Now he can't see all the 5 and he's like, okay, maybe if I just keep my eye on them, I can open the door, run out, get in a car, back it up without them seeing me. And so, without telling Shelly, he opens the door and he goes on the front porch. He sees them out in the field. He's got a good line of sight of them. Quiet as he can, he walks down the steps and he makes his way over to his truck, which is about 10 meters away, and he is getting closer and closer to his truck. He's got his eyes on the creatures that are in the field. They haven't moved. That's good. They apparently haven't seen him. What's good? So he gets to the driver's side of his truck. He's got his keys out and he's kind of fumbling to hit the unlock button, and then his motion sensor light kicks on and he's so on edge being out there. When the light kicks on, he drops his keys because he's so startled, and the first thing he does is he looks towards the field and he sees that one of the 5 creatures is now standing on its hind legs looking at him directly. Before he even bends down to get his keys, he sees them all running towards him. He reaches down, grabs his keys, and he runs back in the house as fast as he can, and he gets inside and he slams the door right as he can hear them crossing the gravel area right in front of the house, and he hears them bound onto the porch and start running around the wraparound porch. He's too scared to even look from the window and get seen through the window, so he ducks down to get out of view. Shelly, who's upstairs, can hear everything that's going on, and she yells at Eric with a trembling voice, "What's going on?" And he goes, "Stay up there, stay up there." Shelly, Eric, Chelsea, everyone just frozen, waiting, knowing that these creatures are right on the other side, walking along this wraparound porch. And after a while, he hears the footsteps of these creatures leave the porch and go back onto the gravel area. And at some point, he pokes his head up and he looks, and all 5 are sitting there, just facing the house, waiting for them to come out of the house again. And so he scurries up the stairs to where Shelly and Chelsea are, and they just are so scared, so they decide they've got to call the police. If nothing else, the police will drive up and their vehicle might scare away these creatures. But on the phone, Shelly lets on that what they're really scared about is something on their property. In fact, it's 5 creatures, things running around outside the property, and Immediately, the police officer who's responding to their call is like, alright, well, are you sure it's not a ruse? And she's like, no. And the officer asks, are you sure it's not a beer? And finally, she's like, no, can you please just come over here? And he's like, listen, man, just keep your door shut, keep your windows shut, and I'm sure it'll be fine. And ultimately, that's how the call ends. They're on their own. The family felt helpless, and Eric especially felt a little frustrated because he can't protect his family, he doesn't have a weapon, he can't get to his vehicle, they're just trapped, and so they decide the only thing we can do is barricade ourselves inside of the house. So for the next 30 minutes, they put heavy furniture in front of all the doors and the windows. They blockade everything as good as possible. They got kitchen knives and they got an axe that they had inside to chop some wood. As they go upstairs, they make sure not to make a sound so they don't draw the attention of any of these creatures. They lock themselves in the master bedroom with their weapons and their dogs and just sitting there listening to the soundless sounds of the outside, hearing their fear echoing through their shallow bodies. All they could do is wait until the sun comes out and hope these creatures would go away. During that time, they were barricading their house. They would look out from time to time and they would see the five creatures just sitting on that gravel area right in front of their house, just waiting for them to come out. But when they finally went upstairs and barricaded themselves in that room, they immediately heard the creatures move off the gravel area, and they heard a couple of them at least walk onto the porch and start pacing around the porch, and it's totally silence besides the sounds of these creatures. And they were clearly communicating with each other. They were bumping into walls and then they were howling at each other. There was clear communication happening. They were trying to coordinate some sort of attack on a family, and then it was again total silence. Now the way the house was set up is the first floor wasn't a little bit wider than the second floor, and there was a second floor roof. So it had its own kind of separate roof, and after a while the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They left the porch and it just silence, and then they would hear them jump onto the first roof. But the scary thing about this is that if you walked around the roof, you could actually look into the second floor. And so they laying there, and periodically they'd be looking out the window. There was windows in either side of the room they were in, but there was a thin curtain between them and the window. And so from time to time these creatures would walk past the window and they would stop. They put their paws up onto the window and they would look inside, but there was a very thin sheet between them and the glass, so they couldn't see the creature and the creature couldn't see them, what was good for them. But all night they're listening to these creatures running around, and sometimes they'd hear really loud scratching like they had figured something out and they were trying to burrow their way into the house. But after a whole night, these creatures never actually broke the glass. They weren't able to get inside the house, and as the sun started to come up in the morning, the creatures jumped off the roof and they just hear them running away. But this eventful night of horror left our family still in shock and fear that they didn't get out from the hiding spot for an hour or more. After the sun comes up, they felt safe again, so they took a deep breath and they were able to summon up their last remaining bit of courage and opened up the door of the master bedroom. They slowly walked outside the room, one after another. First Eric left the room, looking around, and then down the staircase, and then walked down the stairs, and right after him, Shelly followed Eric, and still holding the knife, And 2 feet away, Chelsea followed her parents, with still pure fear and thoughts that messed up her brain. Are those creatures still in here? What if they wait for us downstairs? And yeah, but then they reach downstairs and they finally open up their blinds and see nothing. They feel kind of relieved now. Then they notice the morning sounds of birds and the sounds of wildlife seems to be back. So these creatures must be gone. So they open up their door and walk out to the porch. And all over the property are signs of huge creatures that had been on their property. Massive footprints with huge claws at the end. They found tufts of hair that had gotten caught on a fence post, and even scarier is they found all these points on a house, particular on the second floor. There were clear markings that when these creatures were walking on the roof, they had tried to burrow into the house. There were these deep-seated scratch marks into the side of the house. The front door had been scratched apart. It was very clear that whatever these creatures were, they were trying to get into the house. They'd just been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the family that they sold the house and they moved very quickly. And they have not experienced anything like that since they left. So what do you think those creatures were? Were they bears, wolves, or something else? Let me know in the comments what you think. Alright, now it's the fun part, alright? So before we move on, write down your guess and also like the video, it helps the show a lot. But now to the real deal. Which of these stories was right and which one did I make up, wrote down and told you guys? Do you think you figured it out? Or did you fall for the fiction and confuse fiction and reality? For example, Matt's story, is it possible that someone was stalking him without him noticing for over 30 miles? A man who needed desperately directions for the place called Bounce Canyon? If you think, no way dude, you made that all up and fooled us and thought we will believe you, let me tell you, you most certainly are wrong. Because this story is nothing else than the truth and definitely shows you that you should always be prepared while being out in the wilderness. Be careful. Now we have two stories, one being Robert and his friends' traumatizing story, and the other being Eric and his family being hunted by those unidentified wolf-alike and bear-sized creatures, and one of them represents nothing other than the fantasy. So which one do you pick? Let's take Robert and his friend's story for example. A tragic case, what still is a mystery. Do you really think that was a made-up story? Or do you think a werewolf in Eric's story is something mythical and has nothing to do with reality? You just made that story up, dude. Then let me tell you, you are totally wrong. Eric and his family were really hunted down by werewolf-like creatures, and the story of Robert was just my fantasy playing with you guys. Now, did you guess it right at the beginning, or were you fooled also in your second guess? Let me know, because I'm damn sure I won the bet. If you won, just prove it, man. Come on. Alright? And also subscribe for more stories where fiction and reality collide and hide within life.
Man, this might be something lethal.
See you next time.
Like a beast that can't be tamed. This the kind of rage you can't contain. Yeah, this might be something lethal. You can really see the flames. Feeling like it's borderline insane. Man, this might be something lethal. Something lethal. might be something lethal. Shit.